Title: He abandoned me on the roadside on a rainy night for his mistress, but his archrival rescued me. Chapter 1: Abandoned in the Rain. The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the empty road and drowning out Sophia Lee's pleas. She stood by the roadside, shivering, as Henry Lou glared at her from the driver's seat of his sleek car. His words were like daggers, cold and unyielding. "Don't make this difficult, Sophia. She needs me more than you do." With that, he slammed the door and sped off, leaving her behind. Sophia stood frozen, the biting wind slicing through her soaked clothes, her heart breaking as she watched the taillights vanish into the distance. Moments later, the roar of another engine broke through the storm. A car sped recklessly toward her, headlights blinding in the darkness. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to move, but her body refused to obey. The car swerved wildly, crashing into the guardrail mere feet from where she stood. The impact sent debris flying, and Sophia was thrown to the ground. Pain exploded through her body, and as her vision blurred, she realized she was bleeding, badly. Just as she thought this was the end, strange glowing text floated before her eyes, as if the night sky itself was a screen. The words were chilling. "The unforgettable first love is dead, and then it's the same old story of the stand-in stepping up and being repeatedly abused." Another line followed, "Poor Andrew. He doesn't even know that the person he's loved for so long was so close to him when she died." Sophia's mind spun, the pain mingling with confusion. Who was Andrew? Why did the words seem directed at her? Desperation clawed at her as her strength waned. From deep within, a memory surfaced: Andrew Wu, her archrival and the one man who might still answer her call. With trembling fingers, she dialed his number, the phone slipping slightly in her bloodied hand. His voice came through, sharp and cold: "If you're dying, why are you calling me?" Before Sophia could respond, darkness consumed her, leaving her fate in the hands of the man she hated most. Chapter 2: In the Hands of the Enemy. Sophia woke to the sensation of soft sheets against her skin and a faint, antiseptic smell lingering in the air. Her body ached, every movement sending sharp pain through her ribs. As her eyes fluttered open, she saw Andrew Wu sitting across the room, legs crossed and a faint smirk on his lips. "Good morning, Miss Lee," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Imagine my surprise when you, of all people, called me last night. I didn't realize you trusted me so much." His mocking tone made Sophia's blood boil, but she couldn't muster the energy to retort. She forced herself to sit up, wincing. Memories of the accident came flooding back, along with the bitter realization of Henry's betrayal. "Why did you save me?" she asked weakly, her voice barely a whisper. Andrew's expression darkened momentarily before he shrugged nonchalantly. "Because I wasn't ready to let you die," he replied, his words as cold as his gaze. Sophia frowned, unsettled by his cryptic response. She had always seen Andrew as her nemesis, calculating, ruthless, and utterly devoid of compassion. Yet here he was, her unlikely savior. The tension in the room was palpable. Andrew leaned forward, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. "Tell me, Sophia, why didn't you call Henry? Surely your knight in shining armor would have come running." His words stung, a cruel reminder of Henry's abandonment. Sophia clenched her fists, refusing to let him see her tears. "That's none of your business," she snapped, though her voice trembled. Andrew's smirk widened, as though her pain amused him. "Oh, but it is. You see, Miss Lee, you're in my hands now. And I always collect what I'm owed." As he stood to leave, the barrage of glowing text appeared again in Sophia's mind, hovering like an ethereal presence. He saved her because he couldn't bear to lose her. Isn't it obvious? Another line followed quickly: "Even in his cruelty, there's love. Look closely, Sophia." She shook her head, trying to dispel the hallucination. Love? The idea was absurd. Andrew Wu didn't care about anyone but himself. Yet as he turned to leave the room, his hand lingered briefly on the doorframe, a fleeting hesitation that left Sophia wondering if there was more to Andrew than she had ever realized. Chapter 3: The Enemy's Game. Sophia spent the next few days confined to Andrew's mansion, a place as cold and unwelcoming as its owner. The sprawling halls and luxurious decor only amplified her sense of entrapment. She tried to leave once, hobbling toward the main door, but Andrew intercepted her with infuriating ease. His voice was low, almost amused, as he said, "You're free to leave, Miss Lee. But don't come crawling back when the wolves devour you out there." His words froze her in place, not because she believed him, but because she feared he might be right. Andrew seemed to delight in her discomfort. At every turn, he reminded her of Henry's betrayal, throwing barbed comments that cut deeper than she cared to admit. Yet, he never let her spiral too far. When Sophia grew too quiet or her wounds seemed to worsen, Andrew would appear with a tray of food or a harshly worded reminder to take her medicine. His actions were a maddening contradiction, equal parts tormentor and caretaker. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded one evening, her frustration boiling over. "Why pretend to care when all you want is to see me suffer?" Andrew's only response was a sharp, humorless laugh. As the days passed, Sophia began noticing cracks in Andrew's icy demeanor. She caught him staring at her once, his expression unreadable, before he quickly masked it with his usual indifference. He was always watching, always calculating, as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The glowing text appeared again one night while she lay awake, the words clearer than ever, "He's hiding something. Look beyond the mask, Sophia." She dismissed it as her imagination, but a nagging feeling told her there was more to Andrew Wu than she had ever understood. Her suspicions deepened when she stumbled upon a folder in his study. It contained photos and documents tied to her accident, evidence that someone had tampered with her brakes. Heart-pounding, Sophia realized Andrew had been investigating her all along. Confronting him only added to her confusion. "Why do you have this?" she demanded, holding the folder up like a weapon. Andrew's gaze darkened, his voice colder than she'd ever heard. "Because, Miss Lee, you're not the only one with enemies. Now sit down before you get yourself killed again." His words sent a chill down her spine, and for the first time, she wondered if Andrew's obsession with her was rooted in something far deeper than revenge. Chapter 4, The Rivalry Deepens. Andrew's mansion became both a refuge and a prison, and Sophia found herself walking a fine line between fear and curiosity. She couldn't shake the feeling that Andrew knew more about her life than he let on. His questions about Henry became more pointed, each one laced with barely veiled disdain. "Tell me," he said one afternoon, his voice casual but his eyes sharp. "How does it feel to be discarded like yesterday's news? Do you still love him?" Sophia bristled, refusing to answer. Andrew smirked, but there was no real amusement in it. "I didn't think so," he muttered, almost to himself. Despite his biting remarks, Andrew's actions continued to confuse her. One evening, he returned to the mansion late, his knuckles bloodied and his jaw set in a grim line. Sophia didn't ask what had happened, but the glowing text appeared again, offering its cryptic commentary, "He fought for her. She'll never know how far he's willing to go." It was maddening, this constant push and pull between reality and whatever strange hallucinations she was experiencing. She told herself it was exhaustion, trauma playing tricks on her mind, but part of her couldn't help but wonder if there was a grain of truth in it. Sophia's own feelings began to shift in ways she couldn't control. She still hated Andrew for his cruelty, but she couldn't deny the moments of vulnerability she glimpsed in him. Late at night, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him pacing the halls, muttering to himself. Once, she caught him standing by her door, his hand hovering over the handle before he turned and walked away. The glowing text returned that night, whispering a single word, "conflicted." The tension between them finally came to a head during a heated argument. Andrew accused her of being blind to Henry's true nature, while Sophia fired back that Andrew was no better. "You think saving me gives you the right to control me?" she shouted, her voice shaking. Andrew's response was swift and brutal. "I don't want to control you, Sophia. I want you to wake up. Henry left you to die. I saved you. Don't ever forget that." His words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Sophia saw the raw pain behind his anger. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, leaving them both in a silence that spoke volumes. Chapter 5, Whispers of Truth. The days blurred into weeks as Sophia recovered under Andrew's reluctant care. Her mind often drifted to the accident, the cryptic texts, and Andrew's increasingly erratic behavior. One evening, while exploring the mansion in his absence, she found a locked drawer in his office. Curiosity got the better of her, and after some effort, she managed to pry it open. Inside were files, photographs, and letters, all connected to her. Sophia's breath caught as she read through them. There were notes detailing her childhood, her schooling, even her brief career before she met Henry. But what truly stunned her was a faded photograph of her younger self tucked in the corner. When Andrew returned, she confronted him with the picture. "Why do you have this?" she demanded, holding it up like an accusation. For the first time, Andrew didn't deflect or mock her. Instead, his expression darkened, a mixture of anger and something she couldn't quite place. "I had my reasons," he said, his voice cold. "Reasons you wouldn't understand." But Sophia wasn't satisfied with his evasiveness. "Tell me the truth, Andrew. Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much about me?" His silence was deafening, and when he finally spoke, it was with a bitterness that cut deep. "Because I don't have a choice, Sophia. I never did." The glowing text reappeared that night as Sophia lay awake, clutching the photograph. "The past binds them together, even if she doesn't see it yet." Another line followed quickly, "The truth will hurt, but it's the only way forward." Frustration bubbled inside her. What truth? What past? She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, caught between Andrew's cryptic actions and the eerie messages that seemed to taunt her at every turn. The next morning, Andrew seemed distant, as though her discovery had unsettled him. He avoided her gaze, his usual sharp remarks replaced with terse, one-word answers. But as she prepared to press him for more, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the tense silence. Sophia's heart raced as the front door burst open and Henry stormed in, his face twisted with fury. "Sophia," he bellowed, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Andrew was on his feet in an instant, his posture rigid. "You have no business here, Lou," he said coldly, stepping between Henry and Sophia. Chapter 6, Collision of Rivals. Henry's presence reignited every wound Sophia had tried to suppress. He looked at her with a mix of anger and desperation, as though he had any right to feel betrayed. "Sophia, you don't belong here," he said, ignoring Andrew entirely. "You belong with me." Sophia's laughter was bitter. "Belong with you? The man who left me to die on the side of the road for his mistress?" Her words struck like a whip, and Henry flinched, but he quickly recovered. "It wasn't like that," he protested. "I was." "You were making excuses," Andrew cut in, his voice laced with venom. "And now you think you can waltz in here and reclaim what you threw away? Pathetic." The tension between the two men crackled like a live wire. Henry stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Stay out of this, Wu. This is between me and Sophia." Andrew's smirk was sharp enough to draw blood. "Oh, but it isn't. You see, Lou, Sophia isn't yours to command anymore. She's free, something you'll never understand." Sophia stood frozen as the two men squared off, their animosity palpable. She wanted to scream, to tell them both to leave her alone, but the words wouldn't come. The glowing text appeared again, more vivid than ever. "The battle isn't just for her freedom. It's for her heart. Choose wisely, Sophia." Her pulse quickened, anger and confusion swirling inside her. She wasn't a prize to be fought over. She was her own person, and she'd had enough of being treated otherwise. Before she could voice her thoughts, Henry lunged, his fist aimed at Andrew's jaw. Andrew dodged with infuriating ease, countering with a shove that sent Henry stumbling. "Enough!" Sophia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Both men turned to her, their expressions a mix of surprise and guilt. "I'm done with both of you," she said, her voice trembling. "If you can't respect me, then you don't deserve to be in my life." The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time, Sophia felt a flicker of control over her own fate. Chapter 7, The Heart's Dilemma. The next few days felt like a slow unraveling of everything Sophia had once believed. She couldn't shake the image of Henry and Andrew, standing in front of her like two halves of her past, both claiming ownership of her future. Despite her words, despite the way she had tried to distance herself from both men, something in her heart still ached. She hated herself for it, for the weakness that lingered even after all that had happened. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Henry's face, the one she once loved so deeply, the one who had discarded her so callously. And yet, there was Andrew, his cold presence never far away, watching, waiting. Sophia knew she couldn't stay in this house forever. She had to leave, had to reclaim her life, but every time she tried, something stopped her. She was caught in a web of emotions, tangled between the bitter resentment she felt for Henry and the strange, magnetic pull Andrew seemed to have on her. When Andrew was near, the glowing texts would appear more frequently, more urgently, as though they were trying to steer her towards something, or perhaps away from it. You can't escape the truth, Sophia. It's closer than you think. One evening, as she sat in the garden, lost in thought, Andrew found her. He didn't speak at first, merely sat beside her, his presence heavy in the air. You should leave, he said quietly, his voice betraying a softness she hadn't heard before. You don't belong here, and I won't keep you against your will. Sophia glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She didn't answer at first, the tension between them thickening. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where I belong anymore. Andrew's gaze softened as he looked at her. You're not as alone as you think. But the choice, as always, is yours. His words hung in the air, unsettling in their simplicity. It felt like he was offering her something beyond the hostility and control. But before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from the house, followed by Henry's voice, frantic and angry. Sophia. Get out here now. Chapter 8, Unveiling the Past. Henry's voice snapped Sophia back into reality. Without thinking, she stood up, her body tense, ready to face whatever confrontation awaited her. But Andrew's hand on her arm stopped her. You don't owe him anything, he said quietly, his tone insistent. Sophia pulled her arm away from his grip, her pulse racing. I don't owe either of you anything, she muttered, but her feet carried her toward the source of the commotion. As she entered the house, she found Henry in the foyer, his face pale with anger and something else, a fear. Sophia, you don't know what's going on, he started, his words tumbling out. I've been trying to protect you. Andrew, he's not what you think. Before he could finish, Andrew appeared behind her, his expression as unreadable as ever. You're wasting your time, Lou. She knows everything. You can't lie your way out of this one. Sophia's head was spinning. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the past and the present pressing down on her. Stop, she said, her voice shaking. Just stop. I can't keep doing this. Both men turned to her, their expressions mixed with frustration and confusion. I need to know what's going on, she continued, her tone firm. What are you both hiding from me? Andrew's cold smile returned, but it wasn't as triumphant as before. He looked at Henry, then back at Sophia. You really don't know, do you? He asked softly. Henry isn't the man you think he is. He was never going to save you. I did. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as the realization hit her. She had been nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game, a game that had started long before she even knew it. She didn't know how to respond, her mind a blur of emotions and thoughts. The truth, whatever it was finally starting to come to light, and it was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Chapter 9, Revelations and Choices. In the following days, the weight of the revelations began to settle on Sophia. Andrew's words haunted her, replaying in her mind at all hours. I saved you. Henry wasn't going to. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that something had happened long before her accident that tied her fate to both of these men. Her mind raced with questions, but no answers seemed forthcoming. Andrew continued to maintain his cold distance, though there were moments when his eyes softened when he looked at her, as if he were struggling with something he didn't want to reveal. She found herself drawn to him, despite everything, despite the way he seemed to toy with her emotions. But she couldn't bring herself to trust him, not yet. Not when she didn't know the full story. One afternoon, Sophia decided to confront Henry. She met him in a secluded part of the mansion, away from Andrew's prying eyes. "Tell me the truth, Henry," she demanded, her voice steady but tinged with the pain of betrayal. "What is your connection to Andrew? Why are you both so obsessed with me?" Henry's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment, he looked like a man caught in a web of his own making. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't want you to get hurt, Sophia. But there were things I couldn't control, things I didn't know until it was too late." Sophia felt a knot tighten in her chest. "What things, Henry?" But before he could answer, Andrew appeared at the door, his expression unreadable. "You'll get your answer soon enough," he said, his voice cold. "But it's not going to be the one you want." Chapter 10, Unraveling the Truth. The tension between Sophia, Henry, and Andrew grew unbearable. Each passing day felt like a slow burn, the truth lingering just out of reach, teasing her with its proximity. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something monumental, something that would finally explain everything. Her nights were filled with restless dreams, the faces of the two men shifting and blending, their intentions unclear. But one thing was certain, both were keeping secrets, and those secrets were about to come crashing down. It was late one evening when Sophia found herself alone with Andrew in the mansion's library. He was sitting by the window, staring out into the darkened garden. She hesitated before speaking, the words feeling heavier than ever. "I need you to tell me everything. No more lies. No more games." Andrew didn't turn to face her, but she could feel his presence, cold and commanding. "You won't like what you hear," he replied softly, his voice tinged with a bitter edge. Sophia took a deep breath and stepped closer, her resolve hardening. "I don't care anymore. Just tell me." Andrew's gaze flickered briefly to hers, and for a fleeting moment, there was something almost vulnerable in his eyes. "It was always about you, Sophia. The moment you came into my life, everything changed. You were never meant to be with Henry. You were meant to be with me." His words hit her like a slap, leaving her breathless. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew finally turned to face her, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I wasn't just some rival to Henry. We were both part of something much bigger, something that involved you from the very beginning. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't stay away either." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I couldn't let you be his. Not when you were always meant to be mine." Sophia stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. She had always believed that her relationship with Henry had been one of love and betrayal. But now, it seemed that there was more at play. A force beyond her control, pulling the strings of her fate. Before she could process what Andrew had said, Henry stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger. "What is this, Sophia?" "You're listening to him now," he spat, glaring at Andrew. Sophia's mind was spinning. "Henry, tell me the truth. What is going on between you two?" Henry hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's too late, Sophia," he said finally, his voice low and filled with regret. "You wouldn't understand. But I never wanted any of this to happen. Not to you." "Then tell me," Sophia demanded, her voice breaking. "Tell me everything." Henry's eyes flickered with something of fear, maybe, before he turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "It was always going to end this way. With you, Andrew, and me. It was never supposed to be any other way." Chapter 11, The Price of Truth. The revelation that both Henry and Andrew were bound by a shared history, and by her, sent a shockwave through Sophia's entire being. She couldn't process it all at once. There were too many unanswered questions, too many layers of deceit. But one thing was painfully clear, the men she had known, the men she had loved, were not what they appeared to be. The truth was more complicated, more tangled than she had ever imagined. The next day, Andrew summoned her to the garden. His expression was unreadable as she walked toward him, and for a moment, she wondered if he even cared about what she was going through. But as he spoke, his tone softened. I can't explain everything, Sophia. Not yet. But I will. He looked at her, his eyes searching. You've always been part of this, even before you knew it. The question is, do you want to be a part of it now? Sophia shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. You can't just ask me that, Andrew. You can't just drag me into this without explaining anything. Andrew stepped closer, his gaze intense. You have a choice now. And you're going to have to decide soon, Sophia. You can walk away from all of this, from me, from Henry, and live the life you've been wanting. Or you can accept the truth and fight for what's yours. Sophia took a step back, her heart racing. The choice seemed impossible, a cruel irony after everything she had been through. I don't know if I can trust either of you anymore, she admitted quietly. I don't know what's real anymore. Andrew's face softened, and for a moment, he seemed to hesitate. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to make you feel like a pawn in our game. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. But I do need you, Sophia. More than you can understand. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She felt the pull between them, the magnetic force of his words, but something inside her resisted. I don't know what you want from me, she said finally, pulling away. I need time. Time to figure this out on my own. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable once more. I can't force you to make a choice, but the clock is ticking. And so is the truth. As Sophia walked away from him, the weight of his words stayed with her, heavy and oppressive. She was running out of time, and the truth was slipping through her fingers like sand. But the question remained, was she ready to face it? And more importantly, would she survive the consequences of what she might find? Chapter 12, The Tipping Point. Sophia barely slept that night, her mind consumed with everything she had learned. The words Andrew had said kept repeating in her mind, echoing through her thoughts, as she tried to make sense of the tangled web that had ensnared her. Henry and Andrew, once rivals, were now connected by a shared history, and she was at the center of it all. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for her future, her choices? The morning light barely broke through the curtains when she received a message from Henry. Her heart skipped a beat as she read it. Meet me at the old house. There's something you need to know. Sophia felt a knot form in her stomach. The old house was where they had first met, the place where their love had started to bloom. But now, it felt like a trap, an ominous reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to go. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth forever, and if she was ever going to understand what had truly happened between her, Henry, and Andrew, this might be her only chance. As she arrived at the old house, the memories hit her like a flood. The house was as she remembered, worn but warm, full of the echoes of their shared past. Henry was waiting for her inside, his back to her as he stood by the window, staring out at the overgrown garden. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something, regret, sorrow, perhaps even love, in his eyes. I never wanted it to end like this, Sophia, he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion. But you need to understand, there was so much more at play than you knew. I did what I had to do. Sophia crossed the room, her eyes never leaving his. What do you mean? What were you hiding from me? Why did you leave me? Why did you do all of this? Her voice cracked with emotion, the pain and confusion too much to bear. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair as he turned back to the window. It's complicated. But I made choices, Sophia. And those choices, those decisions I made, are what brought us to this point. I'm not proud of them, but I can't change the past. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she moved closer to him. Tell me the truth, Henry. No more lies. No more secrets. He turned to face her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something else, something darker. It was never supposed to be like this. I was never supposed to love you, Sophia. You were always meant to be a pawn in a much bigger game. A game that was already in motion long before we ever met. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She felt the room spin, her vision blurring as the truth began to sink in. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had never truly been hers. She had been a part of something much larger, something she didn't understand. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Henry took a step closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're a part of this, Sophia. You were always meant to be with Andrew, not me. I was just a distraction, a means to an end. But you were never meant to be with anyone else. You were meant to be his." Sophia staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps. "No. This can't be true. I don't believe you." But Henry's expression didn't waver. "You don't have to believe me, but the truth is the truth. You and Andrew are part of something far bigger than the love story you think you know. And now, it's time for you to choose. You can stay with me, or you can go to him. But you can't have both. Not anymore." Sophia felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, heavy and suffocating. She had been a pawn in their game all along, but she hadn't known it until now. She wasn't sure whether to feel betrayed or relieved. Her entire world had been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure if there was a way back from this. Before she could respond, the door opened behind her, and Andrew stepped inside. His gaze flicked between them, cold and calculating. "It's done, then," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Sophia, the choice is yours. You know what you have to do." Sophia turned to face him, her heart racing. She couldn't deny the pull between them, the way he had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his moment. But now, with Henry's words still echoing in her mind, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Chapter 13, The Crossroads. Sophia's mind raced as she stood there, caught between two men who had shaped her world in ways she never imagined. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around her, threatening to pull her under. The choice before her was impossible. How could she choose between them when both of their truths were shrouded in mystery and lies? Henry's words echoed in her ears, "You were always meant to be with Andrew." But then Andrew's cold, calculating gaze made her question everything. Was she truly meant to be with him, or was this just another manipulation, another twist in their tangled game? Her thoughts were interrupted when Andrew took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "It's time to make a decision, Sophia. We can't go on like this. You need to choose who you want to be with. There's no going back." Sophia clenched her fists, her mind a storm of emotions. She had always known there was something more to their relationship, but she had never imagined it would be this complicated. The truth was elusive, shifting like smoke, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face it. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why now?" Andrew's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Because you were always part of this, Sophia. You were always meant to be mine. You just didn't know it yet." Chapter 14, The Unraveling. Sophia stood frozen, the weight of Andrew's words crashing down on her like a wave. She had always sensed that there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of their connection, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. The realization that her entire relationship with both Henry and Andrew had been a part of some larger plan, some tangled game, left her feeling like a mere spectator in her own life. "You don't get to decide for me, Andrew," she finally said, her voice firm despite the fear that was threatening to overtake her. "I am not a pawn in your game, or in Henry's game. I won't let you control me." Andrew's expression faltered for a brief second, his cool demeanor cracking. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating look that had first drawn her to him. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You never had a choice, Sophia. You just didn't realize it until now. The truth is, we're bound by something far deeper than you understand." Sophia's chest tightened, the words choking her. "What truth? What could possibly be deeper than the lies you've both been feeding me?" She felt the fury rise within her, burning away the confusion and fear. Andrew didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at her, as if weighing her every word. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll find out soon enough. You can't escape what's already been set in motion. But make no mistake, Sophia, I'll always be the one to pull the strings." And Henry, he paused, letting the name hang in the air like a threat. He doesn't know what he's dealing with. Not anymore. Sophia's heart raced, the tension in the room so thick she could almost taste it. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but every word felt like it was trapped behind a wall. She had spent so much time trying to make sense of everything, trying to piece together the fragments of her past, only to realize that her reality had been carefully crafted by two men who held all the power. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "Why me? Why this game?" Andrew's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're the key to everything, Sophia. You always have been. And now, you'll finally understand the role you were meant to play." Suddenly, there was a sharp sound, a knock at the door, loud and insistent. Andrew's expression hardened, his smile disappearing as he turned toward the sound. Sophia glanced toward the door, unsure of what was happening. Without waiting for an invitation, the door swung open, revealing none other than Henry, standing there with a stormy expression on his face. His eyes locked onto Andrew, then shifted to Sophia. The tension in the room intensified as Henry stepped inside, his posture rigid and his voice cold. "Enough, Andrew," he said, his gaze never leaving his rival. "You've had your turn. Now, it's my turn to explain." Sophia's head spun, her thoughts tumbling over each other. Was this it? The moment when the truth would finally come out? Or was this just another game they were playing at her expense? Henry turned to her, his eyes softer than they had been moments before, but the sorrow in them was unmistakable. "Sophia," he began, his voice quieter now, "I need you to listen to me. The truth is, I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to push you away, but there are things you don't understand. Things that go far beyond us. Things I was forced to keep hidden, even from you." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What things?" Henry's expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked like a man lost in his own web of lies. He took a step closer to her, as if trying to close the distance between them, but Sophia stepped back, her eyes not leaving his. "I was never supposed to love you, Sophia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this. Not the way I did. But things got out of hand, and I found myself in a position where I had to make a choice, one that tore me apart. Andrew's right about one thing. You were always meant to be with him. I was just a complication, a temporary obstacle in the way of something much larger." Sophia shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "How could you say that? How could you just throw everything away like it meant nothing?" Henry's gaze hardened, and for the first time, there was no trace of guilt in his eyes. "Because, in the end, it's not about us, Sophia. It never was. You were never meant to be with me. You were always meant to be with Andrew. But I was selfish, and I couldn't let go." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as the words hit her like a punch. She looked from Henry to Andrew, then back to Henry, her mind spinning with the magnitude of everything she had just heard. Was it all a lie? Had she been living in a world of false promises, a world where her love for Henry had been nothing more than a distraction? She felt the weight of their gaze on her, but she no longer knew who to trust. She didn't know if she could ever trust either of them again. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice shaking but resolute. "I don't know who you are anymore, Henry. I don't know who I am. But I'm done. I'm done with both of you." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her heart heavy with a mixture of grief and anger. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she couldn't stay in their world any longer. Chapter 15, New Beginnings. Sophia walked out into the night, the cool air hitting her face like a slap. Her thoughts were a chaotic blur, the overwhelming emotions of betrayal, confusion, and anger swirling together, making it hard to see straight. She had spent so long chasing love, trying to make sense of her feelings for Henry, Andrew, and their twisted web of lies. But now, in the midst of the rain-soaked streets, everything felt different. For the first time in a long while, she was free. She didn't know where she was going, or even why she was walking. Her feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her down dark alleyways and quiet roads. But it didn't matter. She needed to escape. To escape from the men who had manipulated her life for so long, to escape from the roles they had forced upon her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it. She didn't want to hear from either of them, not Henry, with his guilt and broken promises, and certainly not Andrew, with his dangerous and controlling games. But as she rounded the corner of a dimly lit street, a car slowed beside her. She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. Was it them? Had they come to track her down? The window rolled down, and to her surprise, it wasn't either of them. Instead, it was a stranger, a man in a dark jacket, his face partially obscured by the hood he wore. "Are you okay?" His voice was soft, but there was an underlying concern in his tone that caught her off guard. "You look like you've been through hell." Sophia paused, unsure of what to say. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know where to go anymore." The stranger regarded her for a moment, his eyes sharp yet gentle. He opened the car door slightly, as if offering her a chance to escape the rain that was starting to pour down harder. "I'm not going to ask you to explain everything. But if you want, I can give you a ride. No strings attached." Sophia hesitated. She had learned the hard way to trust no one, but there was something about his sincerity, the way he didn't pressure her, that made her feel like it might be okay. It had been so long since anyone had treated her with this kind of kindness, without strings, without expectations. After a long moment of contemplation, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay." As she slid into the passenger seat, the warmth of the car enveloped her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. She wasn't entirely sure what she was doing or where she was headed, but she knew she couldn't stay in that toxic world anymore. The stranger didn't press her for answers. Instead, he just started the car and drove, his hand steady on the wheel. The rain hammered against the windows, and the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers became a kind of lullaby, calming her frayed nerves. Minutes passed in silence before the man spoke again. "I know it's not much, but I can offer you a place to stay tonight. Just until you figure things out." Sophia looked at him, still uncertain, but the sincerity in his eyes made her feel like she could trust him, just for now. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice laced with gratitude. They drove in silence for a while longer, the world outside the car seemingly vanishing as Sophia's mind raced with possibilities. Could she really start over? Could she leave behind the people who had tormented her, even if they were part of her past? When they finally arrived at a small apartment building on the outskirts of the city, the man parked the car and turned to her. "You don't have to talk about what happened. But if you ever want to, I'm here." Sophia stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the night starting to lift. The apartment was small but cozy, and it smelled of fresh coffee. It was nothing like the grand, empty spaces Henry had once filled with his cold presence. This place felt real, and it felt safe. As she sat down on the couch, the man, who had introduced himself as Alex, handed her a warm mug. "I know it's not much," he said again, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But it's yours for as long as you need it." Sophia took the mug, her fingers curling around the warmth. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. She wasn't sure where this road would take her, but she knew one thing for certain, she was done living for others. She was done being a pawn in their games. For the first time in years, Sophia was going to live for herself. As she sat in the quiet apartment, the weight of her past began to feel a little lighter, and the first real spark of freedom began to light a fire in her chest. Chapter 16, The Final Move. Days passed in a blur as Sophia adjusted to the new reality she had stepped into. Alex, with his enigmatic presence and calculated approach, had kept his word. He didn't shower her with false promises of safety, nor did he try to manipulate her with empty words. Instead, he gave her the tools she needed to regain control over her life, the skills, the resources, and most importantly, the knowledge that she wasn't as powerless as she had once believed. Sophia had become someone else, stronger, more determined, and willing to face the consequences of the choices she had made. She had never been a fighter, but now, the prospect of taking down the men who had betrayed her no longer terrified her. It fueled her. She had spent countless hours plotting, learning, and preparing. And when the moment finally came, when she confronted Henry and Andrew in that sleek, sterile conference room, it was a different woman who stood before them. Henry looked at her with shock and guilt in his eyes, as though he expected her to fall back into his arms and forgive him. But the woman who had once been his would never return. She was gone, replaced by someone who had learned the hard way that survival meant cutting ties, even with those she had once loved. "You thought you could throw me away like a broken toy," she said, her voice cool and steady. "But I'm not broken, Henry. And I'm done with your games." Andrew stood beside him, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She had thought he was the worst of the two, the one who played with her emotions like a puppet master. But now, seeing the coldness in his eyes, she realized he was nothing more than a man trying to control everything, everyone, around him, even at the cost of his own humanity. "You've lost," she added, her gaze shifting to Andrew. "Both of you." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Henry opened his mouth, as if to say something, but words failed him. He had no defense, no excuses left. Everything had crumbled around him, the illusion of control, the facade of a perfect life, all of it shattered by a woman who refused to be his pawn any longer. Andrew, too, seemed momentarily speechless. For the first time, his arrogance faltered. Sophia could see the slight tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched as he realized that the woman before him was no longer the frightened, broken girl he had used to his advantage. "You're nothing without me," Andrew finally said, his voice laced with venom. Sophia's lips curled into a cold smile. "No, Andrew. You are nothing without me. But unlike you, I've learned to stand on my own." The finality in her voice seemed to hit them both at once. The game was over. And for the first time, it felt like she had truly won. No longer confined by their manipulation or their twisted affection, she was free. As she turned to leave, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, an inner calm that had eluded her for years. She had survived. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had reclaimed herself. When she stepped out of the conference room, Alex was waiting for her, a knowing look in his eyes. "You did it," he said simply, his voice filled with approval. Sophia nodded, feeling the weight of her past finally lifting. "We did it." As they walked together into the future, Sophia realized something profound. She had never needed Henry or Andrew to define her. She had always had the strength within herself. The love she had once sought from them was no longer necessary. She had discovered something far more valuable, the power of self-love and the courage to walk away from anything that sought to hold her back. And in that moment, as she glanced at Alex, she knew that she was no longer the woman trapped in a cycle of manipulation and betrayal. She was someone new, someone who would write her own story, free from the shadows of the past. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The end.